July 28, 1942, Moscow, Soviet Union. As German forces advanced toward Stalingrad, threatening to cut the Soviet Union in half, Joseph Stalin signed an order that would become one of the most controversial commands in military history. Order number 227, 4 pages, 1 message, not one step back. The order was explicit. Any soldier who retreated without permission would be shot, not by the enemy, by his own army. Behind every Soviet fighting unit, Stalin created blocking detachments, Soviet soldiers whose only job was to shoot other Soviet soldiers if they tried to retreat. Officers who permitted retreat would be arrested as traitors. Soldiers who showed cowardice would face immediate execution. Those not killed outright would be sent to penal battalions, suicide units forced to walk across minefields, charge machine gun nests, and atone for their crimes against the motherland with their blood. Over the next 2 years, approximately 158,000 Soviet soldiers would be executed or arrested by their own blocking detachments. Another 430,000 would serve in penal battalions, where roughly half would be killed. At Stalingrad alone, as many as 13,500 Soviet soldiers died at Soviet hands. This was not a secret order. It was read aloud to every unit in the Red Army. Every soldier knew the enemy was in front, the executioners were behind, and retreat meant death either way. What Stalin declared on July 28, 1942 would reveal not military strategy or tactical brilliance, but something far darker. The willingness to sacrifice his own soldiers, not to the enemy, but to his own desperate attempt to restore discipline through terror. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, relax, grab your coffee, and enjoy this beautiful story. By July 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had become an unmitigated disaster for the Soviet Union. In the 12 months since Germany had invaded, the Red Army had lost approximately 4.5 million soldiers killed, captured, or missing. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. Millions of square miles of Soviet territory lay under German occupation. The summer of 1942 brought no relief. Operation Blue, Germany's summer offensive, was smashing through Soviet defenses in southern Russia. German forces were driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The city of Stalingrad, a vital industrial center on the Volga River, lay directly in their path. Stalin watched the maps with growing fury. Every day brought news of more retreats, more lost territory, more units falling back without authorization. The pattern that had defined 1941 was repeating itself. Soviet units, facing German pressure, would retreat, sometimes with orders, often without. The retreat would turn into a rout. The rout would turn into catastrophe. Stalin believed he understood the problem, not German tactical superiority, not German air power or armor. The problem, in Stalin's view, was Soviet cowardice. Soviet officers were too quick to order retreats. Soviet soldiers were too willing to flee. What the Red Army needed was not better tactics or more equipment. It needed iron discipline. It needed fear. On July 16, 1942, Stalin called a meeting of the State Defense Committee. Present were his closest military advisors, Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasylovsky, Clement Voroshilov. The discussion focused on the deteriorating situation in the south. German forces were approaching the Don River. Once they crossed the Don, nothing stood between them and Stalingrad except open steppe. Zhukov presented the military situation with his characteristic bluntness. Soviet forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. German air superiority was overwhelming. Soviet units were exhausted from continuous fighting. Strategic reserves were depleted. The only option, Zhukov suggested, was to trade space for time. Conduct fighting withdrawals, preserve the army, establish new defensive lines further east. Stalin's response was volcanic. Retreat, always retreat. The Germans have already conquered half our country. Where does this retreating end? The Urals, Siberia, the Pacific Ocean? He was not entirely wrong. The Soviet Union's vast territory had always been both shield and trap. Territory could be traded for time, but at what point did trading territory become surrendering the war? The Germans had already occupied the most productive industrial regions. They controlled the best agricultural land. They were approaching the oil fields that fueled the Soviet war machine. More retreat meant more loss, and more loss meant potential collapse. Stalin's paranoia saw threats everywhere. If the Red Army kept retreating, would the Soviet people lose faith? Would occupied populations collaborate with Germans? Would subject nationalities, Ukrainians, Caucasians, Central Asians, see an opportunity to break away? Stalin made his decision. No more retreats. The line would be held, and to ensure it was held, he would make retreat more terrifying than fighting. On July 28, 1942, Stalin signed Order Number 227. The order was not distributed in print. It was too harsh, too brutal, too revealing of Stalin's desperation to risk it falling into German hands for propaganda purposes. Instead, it was transmitted orally. Political officers, commissars, would read it aloud to every unit in the Red Army. The order began with a harsh assessment of the military situation. Stalin did not mince words. The enemy throws new forces to the front without regard to heavy losses and penetrates deep into the Soviet Union, seizing new regions, destroying our cities and villages, violating, plundering, and killing the Soviet population. Then came the psychological assault. Some foolish people at the front comfort themselves by saying that we can always retreat further east, since we have much territory, much land and manpower, and that we will always have more than enough grain. They use this to justify their shameful conduct at the front. But such talk is falsehood, harmful falsehood. Stalin was accusing his own soldiers of cowardice, of making excuses, of betraying the motherland through weakness. The accusation was not subtle. You are cowards, you are traitors, and now you will be treated as such. The order then outlined the new reality. From now, iron discipline must be demanded of every commander, soldier, and political officer. Not one step backwards without being ordered by a superior. Commanders of companies, battalions, regiments and divisions, and comparable commissioners and political officers who leave their military positions without orders from a higher level are traitors to our motherland. Traitors, not soldiers making tactical decisions, not officers conducting fighting withdrawals. Traitors, and traitors would be treated accordingly. The order created 3 new categories of military units, each more terrifying than the last. First, penal companies. Units of 150 to 200 soldiers who had damaged discipline by their cowardice or instability. These men would be sent to the most dangerous sectors of the front. Their mission was to atone for their crimes with their blood. They would lead attacks. They would storm fortified positions. They would walk across minefields. If they survived, they remained in penal units until death or until their crimes were forgiven through suicidal valor. Second, penal battalions. Similar to penal companies, but composed of officers. Commanders who had shown cowardice or had retreated without orders would be stripped of rank and decorations. They would be sent to even more dangerous positions than the enlisted penal companies. The message was clear. Officers had greater responsibility. Therefore, officers would face greater punishment. Third, and most terrifyingly, blocking detachments. These were units of 150 to 200 armed soldiers positioned directly behind Soviet frontline troops. Their orders were explicit: execute scaremongers and cowards on the spot. If Soviet soldiers attempted to retreat without authorization, the blocking detachments would machine gun them from behind. Stalin was creating a military system where Soviet soldiers faced death in front and death behind. The only safe direction was forward, toward the Germans, into battle, where at least death came from the enemy rather than from your own commanders. The order concluded with a chilling summary: "This is the slogan of our motherland. Putting this slogan into practice means we are defending our territory, save our motherland, kill the hated enemy, and gain victory over him." Within days, Order 227 was being read to Soviet troops across the entire Eastern Front. Political officers gathered soldiers and read Stalin's words aloud. The reactions were mixed. Some soldiers felt the order was necessary. Discipline had indeed collapsed in many units. Unauthorized retreats had caused disasters. Perhaps harsh measures were needed to restore order. But others heard something darker in Stalin's words. They heard a leader who valued discipline more than lives, who viewed his own soldiers as expendable resources to be spent without mercy, who would sacrifice hundreds of thousands to make a point about not retreating. And they were right. Private Ivan Ivanovich stood in formation as his company commander read Order 227 aloud. It was August 2, 1942, 5 days after Stalin signed the order. Ivan's unit was in defensive positions outside Stalingrad. The Germans were approaching. Everyone knew a massive battle was coming. As the commander read the sections about penal battalions and blocking detachments, Ivan felt his stomach tighten. 3 weeks earlier, his unit had been forced to retreat from German encirclement. They had received no orders to withdraw, but staying would have meant certain capture or death. So they had retreated anyway, fighting their way back to Soviet lines. Now, listening to Order 227, Ivan realized that retreat had been illegal. He and his entire unit were technically criminals, cowards, traitors to the motherland. That they had survived to fight again meant nothing. They had retreated without orders. The next day, Ivan and 200 men from his unit were separated from their regiment. They were informed they were being reassigned to a penal company. No trial, no appeal, one unauthorized retreat, and they were now expendable. The penal company was assembled at a rear area. An NKVD officer, the secret police who enforced Stalin's will, addressed them bluntly. You have damaged discipline through cowardice. You will now atone for your crimes with your blood. You will be sent to the most dangerous positions. You will attack first. You will take casualties. If you survive and show valor, you may be restored to regular units. If you show cowardice again, you will be shot. Ivan's penal company was sent to Stalingrad in mid-August. Their first mission was to clear German positions from a factory district. The Germans had fortified every building. Machine guns covered every approach. Artillery was pre-registered on every street. The penal battalion was ordered to attack frontally across open ground. No preparation, no supporting fire, just attack. Behind them, 50 meters back, was a blocking detachment. NKVD troops with machine guns. The message was clear: forward into German fire, or backward into Soviet fire. Choose. Ivan's company charged. German machine guns opened fire immediately. Men fell by the dozens. Ivan saw his friend Dmitri cut in half by machine gun fire. He saw Sergeant Petrov's head explode from a sniper bullet. He saw soldiers trying to take cover behind rubble, only to be shot by their own blocking detachment for showing cowardice. Of the 200 men in Ivan's penal company, 87 died in that first attack. Another 41 were wounded. The factory district was not captured. The attack achieved nothing except to identify where German machine guns were positioned, information that regular Red Army units used to plan their assault the next day. Ivan survived that attack. He survived because he kept running forward, not because he was brave, but because stopping meant being shot by the men behind him. He survived 4 more penal battalion attacks over the next 3 weeks. Each time, half his unit died. Each time, replacements arrived, more cowards and traitors sent to atone with their blood. By September, Ivan was one of only 12 original members of his penal company still alive. Of the 200 men he had started with, 188 were dead. They had not died fighting the enemy. They had died because Stalin had decided that discipline was more important than lives. In October, after his 5th suicidal assault, Ivan was declared redeemed. He had proven his valor through survival. He was returned to a regular unit. He had atoned for his sin of retreating without orders. The price was watching 188 men die alongside him. Ivan's story was repeated across the Eastern Front. Order 227 created approximately 430,000 penal battalion soldiers between July 1942 and the order's rescission in October 1944. Of those 430,000, approximately 215,000, roughly half, were killed. They died not because they were cowards. They died because they were used as human minesweepers, as shock troops for impassable assaults, as expendable resources in a war where Stalin valued obedience over lives. Lieutenant Grigory Chuikov commanded a blocking detachment behind Soviet lines at Stalingrad. His unit was 150 men strong, all NKVD troops. Their position was 300 meters behind the frontline infantry. Their orders were explicit: watch the Soviet troops ahead. If any retreat without authorization, shoot them. Chuikov hated his assignment. He had joined the NKVD to fight Germans, not to execute his own countrymen. But orders were orders, and questioning orders meant becoming one of the people his detachment was supposed to shoot. On September 14, 1942, German forces launched a massive assault on the Stalingrad factory district. The attack was overwhelming. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, infantry, everything the Wehrmacht could bring to bear. The Soviet infantry units in the factory were outnumbered 5-1. Through his binoculars, Chuikov watched the battle. German tanks were smashing through Soviet defensive positions. Soviet soldiers were falling back under the assault. It was a fighting retreat, attempting to establish new defensive lines closer to the Volga River. But Chuikov's orders did not distinguish between fighting retreats and panicked routes. Retreat without explicit authorization meant execution. He called his deputy over. Get the men ready. If those infantry break and run, we stop them. The Soviet infantry continued falling back. Some units were retreating in good order, covering each other, maintaining fire discipline. Others were in full flight, throwing down weapons, running for the rear. Chuikov gave the order, open fire. His blocking detachment opened up with machine guns. Dozens of Soviet soldiers fell, not to German bullets, to Soviet bullets. The fleeing soldiers stopped, stunned. Some turned and charged back toward the German lines rather than face fire from behind. Others dropped to the ground, paralyzed by the realization that their own army was shooting them. Chuikov later wrote in his diary, "We shot 114 men that day. How many were genuine cowards and how many were simply retreating from overwhelming force, I will never know. We shot them all the same." Across Stalingrad, blocking detachments repeated this scene dozens of times per day. Soviet soldiers, caught between German fire in front and Soviet fire behind, often had no good choices. Stand and die fighting Germans, retreat and die from Soviet bullets. The only option was forward, into German defensive positions, where at least death came from an enemy rather than from your supposed comrades. The exact number of Soviet soldiers killed by blocking detachments remains disputed. Soviet records from the war are incomplete, and post-war Soviet historians downplayed the brutality of Order 227. The latest Russian archival research suggests approximately 158,000 Soviet soldiers were executed or arrested by blocking detachments during the order's 2-year implementation. At Stalingrad specifically, estimates range from 13,500 to 15,000 Soviet soldiers shot by their own blocking detachments over the 5-month battle. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equal to an entire Soviet division executed by its own army during a single battle. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet soldiers learned to fear their own commanders as much as the enemy. Trust within units evaporated. Soldiers stopped reporting problems or suggesting tactical retreats because any discussion of withdrawal was viewed as defeatism. Initiative was crushed. Junior officers stopped making any decisions without explicit orders because independent action that led to retreat, even tactically sound retreat, meant execution. Some units adapted by creating informal agreements with their blocking detachments. If retreat became necessary, officers would send runners to the blocking detachment first, explaining the situation, requesting permission. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. Blocking detachment commanders who showed leniency risked being accused of cowardice themselves. The system created absurd situations. Soviet units, surrounded by Germans and cut off from supply, would sometimes refuse to attempt breakouts because breaking out required retreating, and retreating violated Order 227. Instead, they would fight until ammunition ran out, then die in place. Because dying in place was heroic, retreating to fight another day was cowardice. Lieutenant Chuikov survived Stalingrad. His blocking detachment executed over 400 Soviet soldiers during the battle. In January 1943, when Soviet forces finally defeated the Germans at Stalingrad, Chuikov was decorated for his service. His citation praised his vigilance in maintaining discipline and preventing panic. He was promoted to captain. He continued commanding blocking detachments for another 18 months. By October 1944, when Order 227 was finally rescinded, Chuikov had participated in the execution of over 200 Soviet soldiers. In 1945, he was demobilized. He returned to Moscow. He never spoke about his war service. When his children asked what he had done during the war, he would only say, "I followed orders." He died in 1967. His war records remained classified until the 1990s. Order 227 was intended to restore discipline and prevent collapse. By that measure, it succeeded. Soviet forces did not collapse in summer and autumn of 1942. They held Stalingrad. They launched the counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army. They turned the tide of the war. But at what cost? The official Soviet casualty figures tell part of the story. Between July 1942 and October 1944, when Order 227 was in effect, approximately 430,000 soldiers served in penal battalions. Roughly 215,000 of those penal battalion soldiers were killed. 158,000 soldiers were executed or arrested by blocking detachments. Unknown additional thousands died in penal companies, smaller than battalions, but still suicidal. That means Order 227 directly caused approximately 373,000 Soviet deaths or imprisonments, not from German action, from Soviet policy. To put that in perspective, the entire Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, cost the Soviets approximately 250,000 casualties. The Battle of Berlin cost approximately 81,000 Soviet dead. Order 227 killed more Soviet soldiers than either of those massive battles. But numbers only tell part of the story. The psychological impact cannot be quantified. How many Soviet soldiers fought less effectively because they feared their own commanders? How many tactical opportunities were missed because officers refused to order necessary retreats? How many encirclements occurred because units stood in untenable positions rather than withdraw? Soviet military historians after the war argued that Order 227 was necessary. Without it, they claimed, the Red Army would have collapsed entirely. The Germans would have taken Stalingrad, captured the Caucasus oil fields, and potentially knocked the Soviet Union out of the war. Western historians are more skeptical. They note that the Red Army had already stabilized the front before Order 227 took effect. Soviet industrial production was increasing. American Lend-Lease aid was arriving in significant quantities. The Germans were overextended. Strategic factors were turning against Germany regardless of Soviet discipline policies. The truth is probably somewhere between. Order 227 did restore a degree of discipline to units that had been retreating chaotically. It did prevent some unauthorized retreats that might have turned into routs. But it also killed hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers who might have survived to fight more effectively if treated with basic human dignity. Stalin's logic was brutally simple. Soviet lives were expendable resources. The Soviet Union had vast manpower reserves. Losing 400,000 soldiers to executions and penal battalions was acceptable if it prevented the loss of the entire Red Army through collapse. It was the logic of totalitarianism. Individual lives meant nothing, only the state mattered, and the state's survival justified any level of brutality against its own citizens. Order 227 was not unique in World War II. The German army had similar orders, halt orders that forbade retreat without permission, blocking detachments in some German units. The Japanese army's refusal to allow surrender or retreat, leading to suicidal banzai charges. Totalitarian militaries often treated their own soldiers as expendable, but Order 227 stands out for its scale and systematic implementation. This was not a local commander's desperate measure. It was official policy, signed by Stalin himself, implemented across millions of soldiers, maintained for over 2 years, and it worked. In the sense that the Red Army did not collapse, in the sense that Stalingrad held, in the sense that the Soviet Union survived and ultimately won the war. But victory came at a cost that extended far beyond battlefield casualties. It came at the cost of 373,000 Soviet soldiers killed or imprisoned by their own government for the crime of survival instinct. It came at the cost of a military system that valued discipline over effectiveness. It came at the cost of treating soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings. What Joseph Stalin declared on July 28, 1942, revealed not military genius or strategic brilliance, but the darkest logic of totalitarian warfare. His Order number 227, not one step back, created a system where Soviet soldiers faced death from their own army if they retreated, death in penal battalions if they showed cowardice, and death from blocking detachments if they attempted to survive. It transformed the Red Army into a machine where individual survival became secondary to state discipline. The order succeeded in its immediate goal. The Red Army held Stalingrad. Soviet forces did not collapse. The tide of war turned. By that brutal mathematics, Order 227 worked. But the cost was 373,000 Soviet soldiers killed or imprisoned by their own government. Men who died not fighting the enemy, but serving as examples. Men who died walking across minefields in penal battalions. Men who died with Soviet bullets in their backs from blocking detachments. Order 227 proved that Stalin was willing to sacrifice his own soldiers not just to the enemy, but to his own desperate need for control through terror. It proved that totalitarian logic, where individual lives mean nothing and only the state matters, could produce military victory. But it also proved that such victory comes with a moral cost that can never be fully calculated. The soldiers who died under Order 227 are not counted in most histories of the Eastern Front. They do not have monuments. Their deaths were classified for decades after the war. Many of their families never learned how they truly died, but they were casualties of World War II as surely as anyone killed by German bullets. They were casualties of a system that viewed them not as human beings, but as expendable resources. They were casualties of a leader who believed that shooting his own soldiers was an acceptable price for discipline. The order was not one step back, but the price paid was hundreds of thousands of steps forward, into minefields, into machine gun fire, into blocking detachment bullets, taken by men who died not for victory, but for the brutal logic that discipline matters more than lives. Stalin won the war, but the soldiers shot under Order 227 paid the price.